Hazel Ying Lee was the first Chinese-American woman to ever fly for the U.S. military. This is the story of how she lived up to her name. Hazel was born on August 24, 1912 in Portland, Oregon, the daughter of Chinese immigrants. She grew up in a small walk-up apartment on 4th Street in Chinatown with 8 siblings, and Hazel was a scrappy, competitive kid.
She makes friends with all the kids in school. She's a good handball player. I remember that very well because nobody can beat her.
She's always in some kind of trouble all the time.
She ran races, played sports, learned to drive, and in general enjoyed breaking the mold. Her mom would say she's not afraid of the wind, koi pa fong. She's not afraid of the water, koi pa shui. When Hazel was a teenager, she went with a friend to an air show where she took her very first ride in an airplane, and it changed her life. Hazel knew she had to fly. To save money for flying lessons, Hazel got a job as an elevator operator at Lieb's department store downtown.
We just go there when she's there, and then we ride the elevator up and down when she was running.
At the time, it was one of the only jobs available to Chinese American women.
Yes, either you would be a stock girl or an elevator operator, or you might work in the theater's restroom in your costume. It was very difficult for an Asian person to find a job.
Hazel and her friends grew up under the Chinese Exclusion Act, a law that banned immigration of Chinese laborers into the U.S. It was a reflection of widespread anti-Chinese racism of the time. But nothing could stop Hazel. She saved up enough money, and by the time she was 20, she graduated from elevator operator to certified pilot. But Hazel earned her wings just as the world was descending into violence. In 1931, Japan invaded China. This was the beginning of a long conflict that turned into one of the most brutal wars in history and left an estimated 20 million people dead. The war eventually bled into the larger global conflict that became World War II. It would be another 10 years before the U.S. got involved. But Hazel wanted to help, and she wasn't the only one. Hazel's piloting skills led her to join what became known as the Portland Group. They were a class of Chinese-American pilots specially selected by Portland's CCBA to train in military combat maneuvers under veteran Pacific Northwest pilot Al Greenwood. Their ultimate goal? Travel to China and volunteer to join the Chinese Air Force. But wait, why did a community of Chinese Americans in Portland, Oregon turn to flight as a way to help China? Well, a few things converged. Aviation became culturally important to Chinese Americans as a path towards the future. This was encouraged by prominent Chinese political leaders like Sun Yat-sen, who founded the Republic of China. He coined the phrase, aviation to save the nation, Hong Hong Gao Guo. Meanwhile, Oregon had become an early hub of American aviation. It was the first state in the country to develop a state board of aeronautics in 1921. And aviation was just super popular here. The Oregonian even had an aviation editor. And there were multiple airports within miles of downtown. So going to air shows would have been a pretty common activity for Portlanders at the time. This was also before aviation became a legitimate profession. So rules and stereotypes around who could or couldn't be a pilot weren't really written yet. Because of all that, 3 of the first 4 Chinese American women to earn a pilot's license in the U.S. were all from Portland, including Hazel. So Hazel and her classmates left the U.S. and traveled to China. But despite a need for pilots, women were not allowed to fly.
She was very disappointed.
Hazel cannot understand why, when all her friends get a chance to fly.
Hazel's mom, her sister Frances, and best friend Elsie all eventually joined Hazel in Guangzhou, formerly known as Canton. And they were in the city when it was bombed by invading Japanese forces.
Where are we going to hide from the bomb? They were just dropping like mad. and she was looking for hiding places for all of us.
In the chaos, they escaped to Hong Kong. Hazel felt powerless.
Being in Hong Kong as a refugee, there was nothing that she could do. So she came back to America.
Back in New York, Hazel took a desk job and tried to find a different way to help. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. was fighting in Europe and the Pacific, and there was a shortage of pilots. So, a woman named Jacqueline Cochran proposed an idea for a new pilot training program, one that would enlist women and train them to fly for the U.S. military. These pilots eventually became known as the WASP, Women Air Force Service Pilots. The symbol of the WASP featured the shield of the Greek goddess Athena, flanked by 2 silver wings. They trained at Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas. As soon as Hazel learned about the program, she applied and got in. Hazel became the first ever Chinese American woman to fly for the United States military. WASP served on bases across the country and worked long hours, 7 days a week. They were often the first to fly planes right off the assembly line, and they transported old, war-weary planes to stations where they could be repaired. They tested aircraft, ferried supplies, and trained other pilots. And Hazel was the best of the best. One of around 100 women out of more than 1,000 who qualified to fly the most high-powered fighters. Hazel was a natural leader in the WASP and well-loved by her comrades. She was well known for her kindness, wit, humor, skill, and tenacity. The WASP were tough, but the military considered these women civilian employees even though they wore the same uniforms, went through the same training, and were expected to follow orders just like an enlisted soldier. The nature of flying the newest, oldest, and recently repaired planes made forced landings a pretty common experience in the WASP. Hazel only had 2 forced landings in her career. The first time, her engine failed over a field in Kansas. She landed safely and was able to call for help. Later, Hazel was beginning her descent to an airfield in Great Falls, Montana, when she got an order over the radio to pull up. Another plane above her was coming in for a landing at the same time. The 2 planes were too close for safety. Hazel pulled up. The pilot above her received the same order. But his radio was broken, and he never got the message. The 2 planes collided in the air. Hazel was pulled from the burning wreck. She survived the initial crash and was taken to a nearby military hospital. But her injuries were too severe. On November 25, 1944, Hazel became the 38th and last WASP to die in service. She was 32 years old. 3 days later, Hazel's family received another telegram. Hazel's younger brother, Victor, a soldier in the U.S. Army, had died in combat in Europe.
Within 2 days of each other in France, in the tank.
And I couldn't believe it. He was such a good daughter. I couldn't sleep for days thinking about her.
Less than a month after Hazel's death, the WASP were disbanded. The United States military would not even pay to transport Hazel's body home, and she was not honored with a military funeral. So Hazel's family brought her back to Portland. They picked out a spot for her to be buried on a hill overlooking the Willamette River.
Lawrence had picked out the spot, and she applied for it, and they said they couldn't sell it to her because we were Asians. And the cemetery in that area was not allotted for the Chinese. They said no. Lawrence is a very mild person, but this one time, she really gave it to them. She says, they had died in the war for America, for the United States, and they are entitled to. And should it not be, she would go to the War Department. They realize it, so they are here. Sorry.
Hazel was buried next to her brother. the shields of Athena engraved on her tombstone. It took more than 3 decades, but in 1977, President Carter finally recognized the WASP and granted them veteran status and benefits. And in 2010, over half a century later, all WASP received the Congressional Gold Medal for their service, record, and revolutionary reform in the armed forces.
Hazel was always so cool that I just can't understand her.
Hazel is her given name. Ying is her Chinese name, Lee, and that's her surname. So it's also Hazel Ying Lee. Ying means heroic.